In the workshop you're about to watch, Sharyll Burroughs references several videos that are unfortunately copyright protected, and we're unable to include them in the body of her presentation. We've added links to them below, in the comments on this post, and on YouTube, so that you can watch those videos in the context of Sharyll's talk. Enjoy the presentation.
Hello, I am Sharyll Burroughs. I am an artist and dialogue facilitator. I would say, context of my work is I am very interested in exploring the question of what does it mean to be human, and why don't we prioritize that over racial categories? I believe, particularly now in our divisive culture and all the things that are happening in the United States, uh, whatever it is, however we define ourselves, all the labels that we use to understand who we are actually more divisive than they are connective. So I help people understand what their humanity looks like and then get into difficult conversations about what all that means for people. So what you just saw are two different scenes from the film Gone with the Wind. Hattie won an Academy Award for playing the racial stereotype of Mammy. And this has left a somewhat tainted legacy in terms of how she's perceived. What was true during 1939 and this era of Jim Crow was that there were only certain roles available to her. And it was difficult to play an ingenue or a socialite and so on and so forth. So these were the roles that were available, and this is what she built her career on. So, in thinking about this duality of here's a woman who, because she played these racial stereotypes, was actually quite independent as a Black woman and privileged. Privilege is not a word that's necessarily associated with the African American community, particularly during this time. So, in thinking about Hattie, what she showed us was that prosperity and independence was possible during the worst of times, particularly for African Americans. Jim Crow was referred to by the expert Ruth Ben-Ghiat, who studies fascism. She called the Jim Crow South an example of regional authoritarianism, which I thought was very interesting. I had not thought about it that way. And I think that Hattie's life is an inspirational blueprint to help us navigate what is happening in our country right now. So, what I'll be offering today are some ideas based on her experience that can help you navigate this uncertainty and this chaos in our culture. And I hope towards the end of my offering that there will be time for you to ask questions or make comments. So I'll just give you a quick little bio before I get into the actual blueprint. Hattie was born in Wichita, Kansas in 1893. She was the youngest of 10 children. Her parents had been enslaved, and therefore, after they were freed, they were still very poor, but they were a very tight knit and loving family. Hattie's gifts were evident when she was very, very, very young, and her parents encouraged this and supported her. In fact, her father encouraged all of his 10 children to go into show business so they could be, let's say, independent contractors, so to speak. They weren't going to be beholden to white people for their livelihood and their financial support, which was very important during this time because most of the jobs available to African Americans were absolutely connected to supporting white people. And he didn't want that for his children. So Hattie embodied a sense of independence from a very, very young age. And because of this, she never perceived herself as a victim. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the high points of what she embodied in the world and what all of this looked like. Firstly, she honored her gifts because her talent was innate. It was something that was within her. And she was born with it, I believe. She was compelled to perform. She didn't have a choice. There was no plan B. It was either she acted or she didn't. There just wasn't any other option. So that doesn't mean to say that at times she didn't have to take domestic work because she had to pay her rent and she had to feed herself. But she never lost sight of her goal and her dreams. And even though she played these roles that were perceived as stereotypes, within the context of being on set and speaking these lines, she did her best to what I perceive to be subvert the perception of what a Black person represented. So even though she was making faces and using incorrect English, you notice in the first clip, she was yelling at Scarlett. Mammy was formidable. This is not the type of behavior that one would associate with an enslaved person. There is evidence that there were enslaved people who actually were, if not in charge, but very close to the person, and this is going to sound weird when I say it, but the person who owned them, but who may have actually ran the plantation or been in charge of the kitchen staff. So this is what I mean about the duality of what happened to these people, because in some cases, there were incidences of power, even though they weren't free in the sense that we understand it. They had power and they had the options to make decisions on their own. So this is a very complicated subject and it makes people profoundly uncomfortable. But I think what Hattie always tried to do, if she could get away with it, was to subvert, undermine the social norms that were in place at that time. And if white people didn't get it, Black people certainly got it when they were watching whatever she was doing. You just sort of intuited that this is what she was doing. She was undermining whatever the character was representing. So she honored her gift. And then because she was successful and a woman of privilege, she used her gifts to help others. The money that she earned, I've repeated this quite a bit. This is her most famous quote. I would rather make $700 a week playing a maid than earn $7 a day being a maid. So whether it was $700 a week or more, or a little bit less, that's a lot of money, particularly for an African-American person to be making during that time. And she used it to support organizations that she believed in. One was the Universal Negro Improvement Association. She supported any sorts of charities that help children, schools. I want to sort of remind people that privilege is not a word that's associated with the African-American experience, particularly then and now, because there's so much, I guess the news cycle functions on Black victimization, which is not always true. So she honored her gifts, and within that also used her gifts to help others, selfless service to others. She was very good at recognizing opportunities. The opportunities would not be necessarily what we would choose because we would find them demeaning, perhaps, but she seized opportunities to perform whenever she could, whatever was available to her. She was known to campaign for roles, which was very unsettling for many in the African-American community. But as far as she was concerned, no role was too small. And in her mind, she was representing the people that she grew up with, the human beings that existed. She said, and I quote, "How can one in your profession not know that millions of Negroes in this country are employed in domestic roles? Surely you don't think the roles I portray are obsolete." So this is very powerful because people get hung up on the stereotypes as opposed to remembering that there were people who were placed in situations that were not of their choice. People didn't choose to be enslaved. People didn't choose to be a maid. They didn't choose to be a cook. This was all that was available to them. They had to work within the circumstances of whatever society or the construct of society made available. So it's very difficult to sort of talk about Hattie, and even though she's a trailblazer, people really get hung up on the circumstances of the life experiences of people rather than understanding that they weren't defined by their circumstances. Hattie was not defined by her circumstances. She knew who she was. She understood the power that she wielded as an actor, and she took that power and she used it to the best of her abilities. So she could see opportunities when others couldn't. And within those opportunities, she created an oasis for everyone that she knew. She created a space where people could come together as human beings. And as her success and notoriety grew, she built a very diverse community. She was famous for her parties at her 17-room mansion. And it was one of the few places in Los Angeles where Blacks and whites could come together without all of the noise of racism. So people would gather at her home, like Clark Gable would sit next to the pianist Count Basie and have a conversation and not be thinking about all the noise that was outside Hattie's house. She also held salons for notable African-American artists, writers, actors, and musicians. Each salon was an oasis for members of her artistic community to gather and have some respite away from, let's say, a hostile society. So she could see what was necessary, she could see what was needed, and she wasn't afraid to provide anything that was going to help the people that she cared about. So another quality that Hattie had was perseverance. She faced many challenges. Some of that had to do with racism. A lot of it also had to do with people from her own culture. Many in the Black community didn't like the roles that she played. She said, and I quote, "The entire race is usually judged by the actions of one man or woman." So in particular, the head of the NAACP, whose name I will not use because I don't like him at all, publicly shamed and demonized her at any opportunity. And of course, she didn't like it, and she stood up for herself. But she didn't allow that to define her. She didn't shrivel up and end up in a corner or stop acting or stop being in the world. She took the punch and she kept going. So in truth, there's always going to be somebody that's not going to like what you do. And they are going to do their best to sabotage, get in your way, make things difficult. So the fortitude that she had to meet these challenges, it doesn't mean that she wasn't hurt. She was a human being after all. But she just didn't allow herself to be diminished. She didn't allow racism to diminish her. So these are qualities that I think are very important to think of how we navigate our way through the world, and I'll get to that in a little bit. She was an evolutionary, or what I call an evolutionary, during the worst of times. Not only did she maintain her independence, she transcended her circumstances. She, as I said, was a woman of privilege, which was very unusual for an African-American woman, and didn't get caught in the materialistic aspects of wealth. Yes, she had a nice house. Yes, she had nice stuff. She had a huge Packard, huge car that she would drive around town. I think she was only like 5'2", maybe. So to think of her driving this car is sort of comical. But at any rate, she transcended her circumstances. This is very, very important because when people visualize the African-American experience during the Jim Crow era, it is all based on suffering, marginalization, stigmatization, unfairness. This was all true, but at the same time, there were people who were thriving, people who looked like me who were thriving. So the only reason Harlem exists is because African American people could not buy real estate within Manhattan. So they had to go north. And what happened was they built a community, but there was also a hierarchy. Sugar Hill and Harlem is for all the rich Black people, and then it trickles down. So this idea of myth, the myth of unfairness, is complicated. So racism is real, and we should work very hard to destroy it. But at the same time, within cultural limitations, hierarchy exists, and there's going to be people who are on top and people who are going to be on the bottom. That's just the nature of humanity. I don't understand why, but that's unfortunately how it works. So fixating on racism, yes, as I said several times throughout my little talk here, is real. But when we fixate on racism, what we forget is that there's a human being who's actually doing their work. And to fixate on racism diminishes the accomplishments that this person has attained. It also diminishes their humanity. So while racism should be very much something that we could focus on or should focus on, there also needs to be conversations about who these people are, not what they are, because what they are has been transmitted or communicated by society. Society says you are this, this, and this based on the body that you're born into. However, we're more than that. We're all multidimensional beings. And we should be celebrating each other from that perspective, rather than to be confined in all of these different categories and boxes. So in thinking about Hattie's life as a blueprint for what is possible for us now in this very difficult time that we're in United States history, let's look at some of the things that I mentioned and talk about what we can learn from it. So she honored her gifts, and she used whatever was cultivated from those gifts to help other people. So do you honor your gifts? And would you risk expressing them within a hostile society? Do you use your gifts to help others? So in thinking about myself as an artist and being out in the world in public, helping people sort of balance what humanity means to them, this is something that might be a little, I don't know, threatening to certain people. So sometimes I really wonder if things got worse, would I continue to do what I do? I hope that I would, but one can never know. So it is something that is worth contemplating, and I think it's very important because we need some thread or access to freedom, and freedom is a state of mind. I'm not Nelson Mandela, I'm not Martin Luther King, I'm not all these people who came forward and really gave their lives so that we could be free. I don't know if I'm that person. I hope I would be that person, but I don't know. So I think these are important questions to think about because I don't know where we're headed, but we need to be brave and courageous enough to simply be who we are and not worry about the consequences until the consequences happen. So she honored her gifts and she helped. She could see opportunities, even when they weren't ideal. It wasn't like she wanted to play a maid, but she did it anyway. And then she created an oasis. So, are you open to opportunities even when they're not exactly what you want? If something doesn't sit right, or a person has an idea that doesn't necessarily resonate, but there might be a little wiggle room where you could offer what you offer in a genuine way. Would you do it? And then what does creating an oasis look like in your community? How can you cultivate a place for people to gather where they can come together and actually be who they are? What does perseverance look like in your life? Do obstacles prevent you from expressing your gifts? How do you handle challenges? Do you allow people to dictate who you are? That's boss culture. We've all worked for nightmare bosses that demand that we act a certain way or kowtow or whatever all that looks like. It's not easy. So, what do obstacles or what can they provide in terms of your personal growth? And then how that personal growth translates into who you are in the world, your most genuine self in the world. Hattie was genuine. She wasn't anything other than who she was. She didn't have any airs. She was a genuine, loving, caring person, despite a society that was telling her that she was less than an animal, literally. So, what does perseverance look like in your life? And Hattie was an evolutionary. And I mean, in the context of she transcended the circumstances of her birth, the reality of the society at that time, the reality of Hollywood that was misogynist and racist, the reality of her culture that wanted to stop her from doing her work. She transcended all of that. It didn't mean that she didn't have things that happened to her. At the end of her life, she was very ill. She died young. She was 50 something when she died. But again, and I keep saying this, but it's very important. She didn't allow any of this to define her, change who she was. So what I've just gone through is, I guess, an acronym. So by helping and honoring opportunities, perseverance, and evolution, the first letters of all those words spell hope. The way Hattie lived, the who of who she was, her choices, all of it, we can use right now to decide what we are going to be in a society that is now profoundly broken. It was broken before all of this stuff happened, but it's really broken now. So, what choices do we believe we have? And how are we going to offer the best of who we are and for the sake of saving democracy and the best of what this country could be? All we've got is who we are genuinely and each other. So it's really time to wake up, and Hattie can help us do that. So I'm going to show a clip now. It is a short clip of her receiving her Academy Award. And just notice the difference between who she was as an actor and who she was in real life. Thank you for joining me today. I hope what I offered is helpful. And if you have any more questions or comments that come to you later, please feel free to reach out to me. And the sisterhood, you can find me anywhere on the thread and so on and so forth. So anyway, thank you.